Open your Bible up if you got one to Acts chapter 27. If you don't have a Bible, there's Bibles in the chairs around you. By the way, that's what I wanted to say. Beverly's home. We got her home. Val spent the first night with her, and apparently we had a little sleepover, didn't we, last night? Holly said she went over and she was going to go in the spare room. Beverly said, "No, sleep with me." So they crawled in bed and slept together last night, just chatted up a storm, I'm sure. Was there a craft too you worked on? No craft. All right. So I don't know how long it'll be before Beverly's back in her seat. But we will be very excited when she gets there. We are beginning now this morning the final push after 9 months. The last 4 weeks of the book of Acts, the last 2 chapters of the book of Acts. And so what I want to do this morning, you're going to feel slightly cheated, but you may feel like that every week. But this morning will be more of an introduction, if you will, for the next 3 weeks. And so it's going to be a little bit like a reality show. It just kind of stops and you think, oh my gosh, what's going to happen next? So maybe I'll make it now. So what I want to do this morning, if I can, is I want to spend the first kind of half of our time together looking at just kind of 4 general observations, if I can. And they're observations about Paul, but they're really observations about our own lives as well. And then the remaining time we'll just kind of noodle on the first 12 verses or so as an introduction, and then we'll end abruptly before we kind of have communion and sing the wee tacos. These observations they're obvious, I think, in some ways. In some ways, they're a bit of a review, which I think is good. But more than that, there are 4 observations that I want us to have in our mind as we look at these last 2 chapters of Acts on this journey. I want you to kind of get your glass out and watch for them as Paul takes this last kind of trek out into the ocean on his way to Rome, quite possibly to Spain. And then, as we look at these observations, I want you mostly to look at beyond Sunday. Do I see these in my own life in any way? And so the first observation I want to make about Paul, really, and it's a broader observation, is just this idea that any journey you're on, any journey, any day, is a mission. Every single day. Brian Fury always has this line, if your heart is still beating, God still has something for you in this world. And what happens to us, I think, in Western Christianity, it is fascinating to me about what we consider missional, if you will, in your life. You will not pick up a commentary on the book of Acts and find any scholar that will call this last 2 chapters a missionary journey, which is really odd. And I kind of get why. Typically, and we've referred to it this way because it's just an easier way to think about the book of Acts and Paul's life when he shows up on the scene, about a third of the way into this scroll, that Paul had 3 kind of standard missionary journeys. And we've studied all 3 of those missionary journeys. But what that does to us, I think, is it tends to box us in our thinking about what our lives are about and what that missionary journey really entails. And unfortunately, I think that this is indicative of our own thinking, that somehow what Paul did on the 3 trips is different than what he's doing on this last trip. And I think we think this way for a couple reasons. First of all, I think in church in general, we're kind of lulled to sleep a little bit to think that somehow somebody that signs up with God for some overseas deal, either a short-term or maybe more likely a long-term mission, where they say go to some foreign country and they're doing this full-time, where they're just sharing Jesus with people overseas, that somehow that is elevated above and beyond our daily lives here, at the Little League field, at the end-of-year lacrosse party, going for a walk in your neighborhood and interacting with somebody that you either know or don't know very well, or going to work in a godless job that has no sense of like higher calling or purpose, if you will. It's just where you go make your money. That somehow that if I sign up for this mission trip, whatever the heck that is, that is now somehow more significant than whatever God wants to do with me right this second. The other piece I think that lulls us to sleep and causes us to think this way is that in this situation, Paul does not appear to have any control over his environment whatsoever. He's a prisoner. When he went back to Jerusalem, they grabbed him. The Romans snuck him out of Jerusalem, took him back to Caesarea. He's been in prison for over 2 years. 2 different governors. They finally are going to, ship him off to Rome to go before Caesar for this big trial before the Roman Caesar himself. So Paul has, in a sense, no control over his life. He's in chains. He's drugged here, he's drugged there. Here's when you eat, here's when you don't eat. Here's when you leave the room, here's when you don't. Get on the boat, get off the boat, kind of stuff. And so when we see that, we somehow think, again, that this is not in any sense a missionary journey because he's not in control. But what Luke will show us in this story over the next 3-4 weeks, as he elevates our view, as he elevates our perspective, is that God is the one still kind of pulling the strings, if you will, in his life. And so what looks like maybe Paul is not in control, God will begin to shift this. So this journey where Paul's completely captive to somebody else, he is on a complete mission from God. I might liken it to work, quite frankly. If you're an employee, you have a lot of times very little control over your life. Here's when you show up, here's when you leave, here's how long you get to take a break. Now, the longer you work and the higher you get, the more freedom you get, but it's just freedom inside the same prison, quite frankly. And then if you really hate that prison, you quit that prison and you go work for another prison. It's, you know what this is like. And there's a lulling to sleep in that sense, I think. And that's what I want to kind of wake us up to in this moment. And what we'll see in this situation is, even though Paul is captive, he's not by himself. These boats he gets on, and there's a series of them, as long as they hold together, he's with other prisoners, he's with sailors, he's with Roman guards, these soldiers. He's even got a couple of Christians with him, followers of Jesus, in the writer Luke and Aristarchus. So he's even beginning to mentor to them. So Paul's got an audience. We've always got an audience. We're always with somebody, aren't we? Sooner or later throughout your day. And I want us to think this way, because this is how Paul would have never said, I only had 3 missionary journeys. He would have laughed had he read that in one of the commentaries. That would have been nonsense. Because to Paul, every day was a mission field for Paul. And part of that question behind that is, a mission field for what? And this would be my second observation. When we hear this idea of a mission field or a mission, or every day every journey is a mission, all we think about is me specifically sharing the story of Jesus with somebody else, and them bowing their knee to God and finding salvation. That's all we think, and that's a massive deal. Do not think for a second I'm undermining that. But for Paul, it's much bigger. And I hope we're seeing this in the book of Acts. And so this really is the second observation I want to make, and that is this idea that we've been looking at of conquering darkness. Conquering darkness. This is the idea of what a mission is. That every day we have a mission from God. And in Paul's case, we're going to be looking at Paul now on the ocean, on the sea, if you will. And most scholars, when they kind of take the tape measure out, these several years of him sailing in these mission trips, if you will, they clock him at over 3,000 miles at sea. So he's quite experienced at doing this. And if we know that's the case, then we have to put ourselves in an ancient Jewish mindset and say, well, why is that a big deal? Well, this is a big deal for all kinds of reasons. First of all, Jews are not sea people. The Jews, they don't really like boats. You can tell with the disciples, right? They get in and want to fish, but as soon as the waves, you never know, these waves could have been this big, who knows? Jews do not like boats in the old times. That's just the way it is. The Phoenicians, they were sailors. The Jews, they're land people. I wanted my feet squarely on the ground. Let's leave it that way. That's the first point. And what goes along with that is the ancient belief, and we see this all over the Old Testament, that natural forces were considered, in a sense, demonic forces working against you. And in particular, the deep dark waters to an ancient Jew in antiquity would have been where evil dwelt. It was this unknown darkness. I love to surf. There are some of you I know that the thought of being in the ocean and not knowing what's underneath your feet, this is the fun of the ocean to me. For probably half of you are like, no thank you. If I can't see the bottom in an ocean, I don't want to go in there. I love that part. That's kind of how a Jew would think in this time. It's nothing short of a sea monster to them. It's where evil dwells. Which brings up the third belief in the Jewish system, which was, and we see this all over the Old Testament in particular, that only God controls the deep, dark sea. That only God has the ability to control the natural forces, and particularly to go in and actually control the evil that dwells in the darkness of the sea. We see this all over the Old Testament. We see this in Noah's story. We see this in the parting of the Red Sea, God controlling the waters. We see this with the story of Jonah. Prophets spoke of this. In the book of Habakkuk, the prophet said this, speaking to God, "You trampled on the sea with your horses, on the surge of many waters." Job said it this way, "Who alone stretches out the heavens and tramples down the waves of the sea?" In fact, in the Gospels, in the New Testament, when Jesus shows up, this is what we see as well. You remember the famous scene where Jesus is on the boat, there's a massive storm, the disciples are on there, Jesus is asleep in the boat, they're freaking out. When Jesus wakes up and Jesus calms the sea where evil dwells, when he calms the sea, the disciples flip out. Well, they don't flip out because Jesus just calmed the storm. They know this is only what God does. Only God can raise his hand and cause the deep, dark waters that represent demonic forces to calm down. And they fall before Jesus and just say, "Man, go! We're so not worthy to be around you." When Jesus walks on the water, it's the same idea. He's not just going, "Look at me, look what I can do," although it's pretty cool. Really, what he's saying is, "I am God. I walk on the evil forces of life and stomp them down." That's literally what Jesus is doing. And so we want to look for this thread. Not only that every day in our life is a mission field, as a missionary journey. Every day, no matter whether it seems like it is irrelevant or not. And in that mission field, what God is calling us to is to actually literally stomp darkness down. To literally walk on water with God to drive the forces of chaos out of this world. And as a part of that, it brings me to this third thought or observation, which is just what a partnership this takes between God and us. It's the kind of partnership we see between Paul and God. First of all, it's a miracle Paul's still alive. When you read this guy's story, hopefully you've been coming to this conclusion week after week. How is this guy still alive? I mean, they're trying to tear him limb for limb in Jerusalem, and somehow the Romans raise him up and take him out, right? Over and over. Wow, you're going to see this in the next few weeks. Beyond that, to me, the greatest miracle about Paul's life is that he's, and understand why I'm saying this, he's still following God. I mean, this hasn't exactly gone smooth, folks, right? I mean, this has not worked out great for this guy. And then he still pursues God. We learned in his letter to the Corinthians in chapter 11, and this will be our entire Easter message, by the way, just a retrospective on Paul. We learned that already before the story that we're going to read over the next 4 weeks, he's been shipwrecked 3 times. He spent an entire night and an entire day, a day and a half, clinging to a broken piece of boat in the water, just floating around. So I assure you, when they put Paul in a boat to take him to Rome, he's like, "Oh, dear Lord, please no, not another boat trip. I hate boats. I'm Jewish, remember? I mean, this is a bad deal. He's under no panacea that this is going to go well." So this just shows you, look at the trust he has in God. Just this deep benefit of the doubt deal, right? Just like, God has proven himself through the story of the Old Testament. He's proven himself in my friends' lives. He's proven himself in my life. I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt. He is convinced that Jesus is the long-awaited Messiah and royal King who will now, as creator, he's the one that spoke creation into being. Therefore, he's the only rightful judge that can make things right. He is now going to put life together one person at a time. Paul is convinced of that. In this partnership, he trusts God. Man, I would have been on that dock going, please, not another boat ride. And he gets on because he gives God the benefit of the doubt. And the reverse is equally as true, by the way. There's a massive amount of trust that God has in Paul. Doesn't he? I mean, just this deep sense that God knows, look, I trust this guy. And you and I, honestly, we have the same thing with God. Now, whether we enjoy that, whether we exercise that, whether we move into that, that's a totally different question. But there is a deep mutual trust that Paul and God share, that we have the exact same thing. So this trust, again, is to wake up every day and say, this day, no matter how, and you know, sometimes you wake up, we have, Brian and I have this, and Jeremy have it, and Josh Smith, all four of us, we have a really tough meeting on Monday. It's a like, you know, they want to fold a third of our company. So we're going to meet with the second highest guy in Kaiser on Monday and kind of walk down the yellow brick road in Oakland. And you know, Brian and I have had a lot of conversations about this. The four of us have strategized. There's just like, oh, so there's a part of it's like, I can't, and I'm sure you've never said this, I can't wait till Monday's over. Right? But this is not how Paul thought. His thought is, Monday is another journey with God. It's another missionary journey. And I'm going to watch, because what God does is he reclaims darkness through us in this mutual trusting partnership. That's what I'm going to watch for. And it brings me to the last observation, which we have talked about the last few weeks. And it's uncanny how many times we see this with Paul. Luke does not want us to miss this. And that is the deep parallels between Jesus and our lives. And it's particularly obvious when we look at Paul's life. I mean, Luke just says it over and over, so that we look at Paul's life and go, I've seen that before, I've seen that before, I've seen that before. And what we should have seen before is, I saw Jesus go through that. I saw Jesus go through that. You know, Jesus goes on a journey, he ends up in Jerusalem. The same thing happens to Paul. Jesus gets picked up by the Jewish authorities and handed over to the Romans. So does Paul. Jesus was interrogated by a Roman governor. Paul got interrogated by 2 Roman governors. Jesus goes before the Sanhedrin on trumped up charges. So does Paul. Jesus then gets transferred over to the puppet Jewish King Herod. So does Paul. And finally, we'll see in this chapter and in the next chapter something akin to Luke's Gospel, chapter 23, where Jesus goes to his death. And we will see something similar as Paul clings to just pieces of wood in a boat. I'm not saying for 1 minute that Paul's life is a ransom for mankind. So please don't hear me wrong. I'm not saying that Paul is now dying for the sins of the world. Jesus did that. But what I am saying is what Luke reminded us in, and I've tried to do it almost every week that we've met for 9 months. That statement in the beginning of Luke chapter 1, where he says what the scroll of Acts is about what Jesus will continue to do and teach. The idea is that Jesus, rising from the dead, says, will you bow your knee to me? Will you acknowledge I'm the long-awaited Messiah? If you will, I will literally send my Spirit within your soul, which is what he does with Paul. I will send my Spirit within you to walk with you and to reclaim chaos and darkness through you. And I wonder if you and I see the same things in our life. Not disconnected, bad things happening, but Jesus actually pouring his Spirit out through us. And we will see this mostly through, unfortunately, the suffering of Christ in our own lives. That's why Jesus said the words, if you want to come after Jesus, if you want to come after me, Jesus said, you must deny yourself and take up your cross and follow me. It's the cross we take up. It's the partnership, the deep partnership on this missionary journey where Jesus pours through us, not to reclaim good stuff, but to actually reclaim darkness in this world. To be available for marriages that are having trouble. To be to be having people in your home that watch you parent in a different way. I was with, we had this, oh my gosh, we had a whole pig smoked Friday night, and we had about 15 of us. So we were picking this pig and eating this pig, and there were two girls that attended here that I won't mention, and they were telling us all about their junior prom, and my jaw was on the ground. You know, do you ever hear stories about younger people, and you just feel like, oh my gosh, I've become my parents. I'm like officially old. We didn't do that. I mean, just they're talking about just the sexually oriented grinding and all this stuff in the dance floor. And these two girls, as they talked, it was fascinating to me. They wanted none of this. Just none of this. In fact, they made up stories about losing their phones so they could get away from it, just stay out a little bit off the dance floor because they just don't want to present their life like this. And what was really sad to me was that what they had brought into in that moment as we talked over dinner was, I'm the weirdo. They literally thought they were the weird ones. They were like, you know, we're the weird ones because we're not doing this. And I looked at them and we talked during dinner and after dinner saying, you're actually the normal one. Don't ever let the masses define what normal is to you. You're actually being dignified before God and showing a different thing in the world, and who knows who saw you. Your two dates might have wondered, wow, these girls are different than anything I've ever seen. Other girls might have seen you and said, wow, I've never seen this before. This is the reclaiming of darkness for light. It's not just when you have the opportunity to share the story of Jesus with somebody with your mouth, though that is so significant. It is any time we see chaos and darkness around us and we put our arms around it on behalf of Jesus. Amen? When you leave here, you never think, oh my gosh, you know, somebody else is on some missionary journey. You're on one the second you leave this room. And darkness will be all around you like it was for Paul. Let's begin to read our passage, and we'll just look at the first 12 verses. Chapter 27, verse 1. And look for these four things over these next 4 weeks. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, Luke doesn't tell us who decided this. They proceeded to deliver Paul and some other prisoners, so there's other prisoners with him, to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. The Augustan cohort is just a cohort of Roman soldiers that were assigned to both Syria and to Judah. And we're introduced immediately to yet another named Roman soldier. This is the second one. The first one, Claudius Lysias, was the one that escaped him to Caesarea. Now we have a guy named Julius. Probably gains his name from Julius Caesar when he gained his citizenship in Rome. And what's fascinating about this, too, to me, and you'll see this for weeks, is that God uses the fact that this guy, Julius, is a Roman citizen, and Paul, we know, is a Roman citizen by birth. And God uses this to create favor in this guy's heart for Paul. We'll even see it a little bit this morning. This is one of these coincidences? I think not. Verse 2, and embarking in the Adramyttian ship, which was about to sail to the regions along the coast of Asia, we put out to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessaloniki, which is really cool to me too. God makes sure Paul is not on this journey by himself. Not necessarily just with other people, but he's got two brothers, the writer, Luke, and this Aristarchus, two Christian brothers, to continue to encourage him and remind him the existence of God, and for him to continue to mentor on the other side. Again, life is always how you look at it. You either wake up and look at your day as just lousy and dark and there's nothing good in it, or you say there's darkness in this day, but I will watch for the light of God to pierce through. And that's exactly what's taking place in this passage. There were no, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but there were no dedicated passenger vessels. It's not like you got on a boat. This is not a cruise ship, right? This is not like, oh, I'm going to catch the 205 to Fairhavens. That's not how this worked. These were trade ships that were then requisitioned by the Romans to join with their passengers on a boat that was already moving cargo to some other place. Verse 3. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul with consideration and allowed him to go to his friends and receive care. Again, always how you look at life, right? So for some unknown reason, this Roman centurion says, I want to be nice to this Paul prisoner guy. Why? Only God knows. But this is what we need to train our eyes to see. And so he's allowed to be shown hospitality by these believers in this place. Again, always how we look at life in two ways. Verse 4. And from there we put out to sea and sailed under the shelter of Cyprus, because the winds were contrary. But when we had sailed through the sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. And there the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy, and he put us aboard it. This is the first mention of any kind of weather problems, and it's, I assure you, a theme that will strike deeply over the next few weeks. And late in the season, when the winds were very strong in the west and the northwest, you had to go on the eastern side of the island of Cyprus. And we'll learn in a little bit in the story that this ship that they're on is actually a grain ship. If you know history, particularly Roman history, you'll know Egypt was kind of known as a breadbasket of grain and wheat and corn. And Egypt actually supplied roughly a third of the grain that Rome used in a calendar year. And so again, this is a privately owned boat loaded with grain to bring to Rome, and we'll talk about when and how in a little bit. But it's operated under state control, so it's contracted by the state. So the Romans can say, oh, by the way, I know you're under contract to bring this grain to our capital city in Rome, and by the way, we're jumping on with it with all of our soldiers and our prisoners, and you're not going to say a word about it. Verse 7, when we had sailed slowly for a good many days and with difficulty, and arrived at Cnidus, since the wind did not permit us to go farther, we sailed under the shelter of Crete, off Salmone, and with difficulty sailing past it, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Laodicea. So they try to enter this port, Cnidus, right? It's the regular port ship where these ships would go into from Alexandria, Egypt. So this is where you normally would put in, but they can't do it. The winds are so strong, they're literally blowing the boat from actually getting in. And I never would have experienced this, but my father-in-law owns this, I guess you'd call it a yacht. It's a 60-foot boat. It's a big boat, but it's a power boat. It's not a sailboat. He sailed his whole life, and then he got just kind of too old. It was too tiring. And so every year, for probably the last 10 years, my family, we go up to Washington, and we get on this 60-foot boat, and we sail, or we cruise, I guess is the term, around the San Juan Islands. I don't know if any of you ever cruised the San Juans. It's just gorgeous. And last year, they had their boat in Seattle, and Lynn and I were with them, and we went over to this, I don't remember where it was, we were in this harbor. And the next day we were going to leave the harbor, and the winds were just blowing like crazy. So I'm in my normal position. I'm the brawn guy, and my father-in-law is a very good captain, and so he's going to pull the boat out of this slip and just pull it out of the harbor. But the winds were so strong as I untied it, it was blowing it into the other boat because the slip was two boats, and then blowing it into the dock. So I'm pushing this boat off, and he basically, normally what happens is I would just push it off and jump on, right? Just step on. Well, I couldn't even literally get on the boat because I had to hold it from crashing into this other boat while he was motoring these dual engines. He said, he's yelling at me, he's kind of deaf, so he's really yelling, and he's yelling at me, and he gets a little stressed when he's pulling it out of the harbor. Just, I'll get you at the end. So he pulls out, he comes back, and it took 2 passes. I'm at the very end of this dock, waiting for him to do a drive-by so I could jump on this boat. Just crazy, right? I tried once, and it's like, no, I'm not doing that. It was like Raiders of the Lost Ark. And you're thinking, how can a boat this big, with this much power, it's a toy in the wind. And that's exactly what they're experiencing in this situation. Where I am now. So they go to this place called Fair Havens, or they try to go in. It's this little bay, and you can see from the map that it kind of curves to the north. So what we're talking about is this blow-up of Crete in the bottom. And you can see Fair Havens on the very, very bottom left of this discussion. So they try to go in there, but they just can't get in. They can't get in. And this isn't a place in winter. They're just literally looking for temporary relief. Verse 9. When considerable time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous, this is a guy who spent a day and a night hugging a piece of boat after 3 shipwrecks. So when Paul says or Luke says this is dangerous. This is dangerous. Since even the fast was already over, we'll talk about that in a second, Paul began to admonish them and said to them, "Men, I perceive that the voyage will certainly be damage and great loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives." So Luke drops this little word, says, the fast is already over. But no explanation, which tells you any Jewish person reading this in this time would have automatically, you don't need to fill in the blanks, and know exactly when this was. We read this, we go, I have no idea when this was. There are many fasts prescribed in the Torah, but only one is tied to the Jewish calendar. It's the Day of Atonement. It's one day a year. Scholars know this is AD 59 because they've tracked it. And so they actually know the exact day when the fast, the Day of Atonement was. It was October 5th of AD 59. Sailing began to get rough around the 15th of September. And sailing got completely shut down from the 11th of November to March 10th. So for 4 months, they basically said, we're not sailing. It's just too brutal. So this is after the Day of Atonement, well after that. So this is more than likely into November. So Luke is telling us this fact to let us know you didn't want to sail. This is terrible. I mean, people literally just put their boats away for 4 months and said it's too dangerous. This is when Paul, with God's help, is sailing to Rome. And Paul's assessment, it's interesting. It says he perceived. It doesn't mean, I don't think, that God gave him some revelation, this is going to be a really ugly boat trip. I think it's because he's been shipwrecked 3 times, he's traveled 3,000 miles at sea, he knows he's well into November, hardly anybody sailed then. And so what strikes me with this, which is neat, it's what I call building blocks. You know, every experience we have in life, good, bad, and different, is a building block. Right? Even the stuff we screw up, God takes these ugly threads and weaves them into this tapestry. So these shipwrecks, God has woven into experience for Paul so he can now actually try and speak wisdom into these. These are professional sailors, and Paul actually knows something they don't know. They choose not to listen to him, which is not real bright, but he knows just the same. Verse 11. But the centurion was more persuaded by the pilot and the captain of the ship than by what was being said by Paul. Because the harbor was not suitable for wintering, the majority reached a decision to put out to sea from there if somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing southwest and northwest, and spend then the winter there. Which leads to the next question, which is, then if this is such a horrible time to sail, then if this Bible thing is true, why would they be sailing after November 11th? It makes no sense whatsoever. Well, interestingly enough, the Emperor Claudius, who was the emperor prior to this period of time, Nero is the emperor during this period of time, the Emperor Claudius had a lot of trouble keeping people in Rome calm. And insurrections in the Roman Empire were bad, and they were troublesome, but they were never more troublesome than at home. And if you wanted to create an insurrection at home, here's how you do it. Have not enough food while you're reigning emperor. So Claudius came up with this great idea. What he said was, I will pay a bonus. I'll pay a bounty to any sailor willing to sail for the 4 months between November 11th and March 10th that will dare to take the ship across the ocean. And if they have damage on their boat, I'll pay for the whole thing, and I'll pay for like double time on the ship. And Nero takes up this exact same thing. So this sailor, these sailors, these are gutsy dudes, right? And this owner is like, this is totally worth it. I can literally make an entire year's worth of salary on one shipment in the middle of winter to make sure the Emperor Nero has food for his people. And so they make this move to take this grain, despite everything that's going on. And this harbor in Crete, and we'll finish with this last statement, is about 40 miles up the coast. And it faced the proper way, but the problem is they can't get into it. And as we'll see next week, they just blow wildly off course. This is a sailboat on top of all these other things. And so what looks like a nice planned trip has gone completely haywire, much like a lot of our weeks. And so I want to just, again, close on those 4 thoughts. Because we need to think this way. This is how Paul thought. This is why Brian spoke so eloquently last week about this chilling calm inside Paul. When we've talked about this for a month, who is this calm in the settings this guy's in? Part of it was this perspective. He knew every single step he took with the risen Jesus. He never would think of himself as, I'm going to work it. Paul would never say that. I'm in prison. Paul would say, we're in prison. We're going on guard. We're filling our car. That's how Paul thought. So every single place Paul went, to Paul, was a mission trip. Every single day. And because he had that mindset, he actually had his eyes and ears open and noticed the people that were around him. He noticed when he said things like, how are you? And so he said, okay. You know when people say that to you? What a opening for us. See, most people say, how are you? And it's just a hello. But how are you? And you get a response back that's anything short of great. And really, Paul's response is, what's going on? How come you're less than great? Tell me about your life. Because for Paul, his missionary day was about reclaiming chaos and darkness on behalf of God. And he never thought of himself as, okay, God, send me out. He thought, Jesus, you dwell within me because I've given my life to you. We will go together. And as we go, give me the perception, not only that you exist, but show me the darkness and what we might do together to take the chair that's laying down and put it back up on its 4 legs like it should. And he trusted God. He trusted God enough to say, no day was a bad day. He had bad stuff in his day, but every day was an opportunity for the risen Jesus to partner with him, to give him an elevated view of life, to give him the front row in every one of those situations in that movie theater to see what God would do in somebody else's life. A huge privilege. It makes sense, I'm thinking of that verse where Paul tells the people he mentors, imitate me because I imitate Christ. Father, we want to emulate what we see in Paul's life. We want to think this way. Father, we are no different than those 2 June girls at the dance. For all day long, we're told non-realities. We're told things like, yeah, this is just another day. We're weird. We don't understand reality of the norm. And every day, your Spirit whispers to us. In the midst of just loud chaos, you kindly whisper to us, I'm here, I'm alive, watch what I can do. So give us eyes to see and ears to hear, like Paul had. And we know then that your calmness and peace will permeate our life like it did in his, no matter how tough his day got. We pray these things in the risen Messiah, Jesus' name.